Hi, Amy.
Hi.
I'm going to start out with on a somber note. I woke up this morning, as you did, to the news that Ed Lee, a friend of mine and ours, had passed, the mayor of San Francisco, and I'm going to be talking a bit about him with Mayor Schaaf in about an hour. But I was just taken by your son's picture with him just 3 weeks ago, and I was thinking if Ed were here today and were with all of us, what would you think Ed would want the deliverable today to be?
Well, first, we were absolutely devastated this morning by the news of Mayor Lee's passing. He was obviously an incredible leader in San Francisco, incredible friend to Salesforce, and just an inspiration in the entire inclusion area. And I think his message would be asking what each of us is doing and what role we're going to play. And one of the things that many people don't know about Mayor Lee is how much influence he has had on Salesforce and what we do with the San Francisco and the Oakland public school districts. That really came out of a conversation he had with Mark Benioff, our CEO, a few years ago, where they were talking about their legacies and how they would want to be remembered. And Mayor Lee really encouraged Mark to focus on the middle schools in San Francisco, and that has led to more than $35 million being committed by Salesforce, as well as thousands and thousands of employee hours giving back in the schools, and that all goes back to Mayor Lee and his inspiration.
Well, thank you for that. I think it's important to just do a hat tip and salute to Mayor Lee and what he did here in this town.
Yeah.
Let me start off on another side. I know you have embraced, as your CEO, Mark Benioff, has done, this role as a corporate activist. It's unusual to those of us who aren't used to corporations being about much more than their bottom line.
Right.
So I have to get to you, is it helping your bottom line or hurting your bottom line to be an activist? But I just want to make this real today, because there's just a lot of crap going on in the world. And also this morning, at basically about 5:45 this morning, President of the United States writes lightweight Senator Kirsten Gillibrand, a total flunky for Chuck Schumer and someone who would come to my office begging for campaign contributions not so long ago, and in parentheses, and would do anything for them, is now in the ring fighting against Trump, very disloyal to Bill and crooked used, exclamation point. 5:45 this morning, so it's probably not his lawyer or others in the room. So I just want to ask, how do you navigate this from this notion about corporate activism? We see a race today in Alabama. You've taken bold stands in Indiana and Georgia and North Carolina. Do you feel like you're knocking the tide back? Do you feel like you're winning, losing? How do you navigate this kind of environment?
Right. Well, it's an incredible time, I think, for corporations and the role that they can play when it comes to social justice. And it's a real shift. I look back at when I was in law school, which it's not that long ago. And when I took corporate law, wide range of students in the class, pretty liberal class. This was at Harvard Law School in the mid-'90s. And yet, when we were asked about what role corporations should play in their communities, even the most liberal students thought the answer was just don't do any harm. Or maybe, give the Little League, the local ballet. There was no concept of the role that corporations are playing today. And fast forward to 2017, and it's almost unheard of for a company to be silent. I mean, their employees are demanding that they step up. Their customers, in many cases, are demanding that they step up. And I think what we've learned is that companies are just incredibly powerful platforms for change. And I don't think that's going to go backwards. I think that's just going to continue.
I mean, what is your playbook for this? Because we were at a dinner last night. I don't know if it's come up today in today's conversation. I learned a few things last night. One, diversity and inclusion, really radically different things.
Yep.
A lot of companies fake inclusion. They bring people on like yourself or other places who end up being fig leaves more than changing the dynamic within the company. So let me presume for a moment you're not a fig leaf, and that you are integral to the company was doing. When you're talking to other people out there that want to rise to your kind of role in the company, in their companies or situations, what is the thing that you can convey to them that may help getting traction inside a company and mattering in a way that makes inclusion real as opposed to fake?
Well, first, I think you're right. Diversity and inclusion, very, very different. And I think as a country, we're getting much better on diversity, but frankly, that's pretty meaningless unless we have inclusion. It is not enough to hire people and say, hey, you're welcome at this company. But really, the only way that you're really going to fit in, or the only way that you're going to move up, is if you act exactly like everyone who came before you. And I think one of the most important things today is recognizing really different styles of leadership and not looking for all of the same traits. I get very, very concerned sometimes when I see kind of executive coaching classes, particularly for women,
Right.
which are usually telling them the way to succeed is to be louder, to speak more deeply, to speak up more. Don't worry about what you have to say, just speak more. These aren't great things
be a
for
guy.
companies, and well, yes. It's interesting. So when I moved to San Francisco, I unpacked a box of books that I think I had moved with me for like 6 different moves up until that time. And I pulled out a book I had bought very early in my career. And before I tell you the name of this book, let me just tell you I loved it at the time. But the title of it is Play Like a Man, Win Like a Woman: What Men Know About Success in the Workplace That Women Need to Learn. You would never say that today. But I worry if we, yes, I worry that we're enforcing some of these things. So,
Right.
the chapters were tooting your own horn, don't expect to make friends, be an imposter. And some of that advice 20 years ago may have been helpful. Today, we can't have that be the message.
As you were in some of your previous roles, were you considered difficult, obnoxious, too loud?
No, probably the opposite.
Uh-huh.
And I remember kind of midway through my career, I was going into a very difficult negotiation, and a senior colleague was trying to, help coach me along. And his advice was I needed to walk aggressively into the room, lay down the law, and he gave me a few kind of choice words he wanted me to use. And he must have said a dozen times, and don't be too nice. I mean, that was just his biggest worry. So I remember I kind of heard him out and then told him that was in no way how I was going to handle the situation. And he looked crestfallen. But then I asked him, I said, when was the last time you sent me into a negotiation or a meeting and I didn't get you exactly what you wanted? And that stumped him. And the point was, those techniques would have worked for him. But if I had marched into that room, smacked the table, and started cursing, exactly, everyone would have burst into laughter. I mean, I would have looked and felt ridiculous. But by doing it, relying on my own skills, I knew I could navigate the situation, and I did.
Amy, another thing that came out of the dinner last night, I've been thinking a lot about this dinner, and for those of you who were there, you gave me a real education. But I asked everyone around the room who the villains were. And one of the folks there, a couple of folks, identified white straight men who, in fact, are VC funders or board members. That the white straight men. So I'm going to ask you about Mark. I think Mark, your CEO, is a white straight man, but he's taken a different path. And I'm interested in what snapped for him, or did Salesforce see this corporate activism as a brand builder? Was there some self-interest in what you were doing? What drove the kind of activism that Mark was doing? I'd love to hear a little bit about Indiana.
So Mark is incredible, and he's been an incredible leader from day one. And I think that this is actually a very natural progression from the type of company that Salesforce is. So when Salesforce was founded in 1999, literally the day he founded the company, he also made a commitment that we call the 1-1-1, which is that he would give 1% of the equity of the company, 1% of employee time, and 1% of our product to nonprofits. And over 19 years, that has grown to a commitment of hundreds of millions of dollars, 3 million employee hours. And every employee is given 7 paid days a year to volunteer, and we're expected to do it. And we have nearly 35,000 nonprofits that run on our platform. And so this commitment to this type of philanthropy, I think it made it a very natural step to really use the business also for social change and social good. And Indiana was when we first really dove in that area.
Tell us about Indiana.
Okay, so in Indiana, this was about 3 years ago, Indiana, and I should preface this with the year before that, we had bought a company called ExactTarget, and ExactTarget is based in Indianapolis. And that immediately made us the largest tech employer in the state. It makes Indianapolis our largest hub outside of San Francisco.
Right.
So Indiana passed a Religious Freedom Restoration Act, or RFRA. And a lot of states have these acts. There's a federal act, but this one had some things that we were a little concerned about. Not paying a whole lot of attention. And our employees in Indiana, through an employee resource group that is dedicated to LGBT issues, we call it Outforce, started bubbling this up and started asking us, what is the leadership going to do? And while we were kind of carefully thinking this through, I looked at my phone one evening and noticed I had a call I had missed. It was voicemail. It was from someone in a PR. And it was this very excited message saying, I think you need to see what Mark just put on Twitter.
Uh-huh.
And it was a statement that unless the law was amended, we were going to stop our investment in Indiana. So within probably 48 hours, there were 4 of us on a plane to Indiana. And we spent the next week pulling together a coalition of other companies. Some terrific companies jumped right in. Eli Lilly, Dow was instrumental. Worked with local leaders, civic leaders, church leaders. And by Friday of that week, we were standing at the state capitol in Indiana with the law being amended.
Yeah.
And what we thought was then a one-term governor, who is now our vice president, signed the law into effect that afternoon. So incredible. It was an incredible week. But I really think when we look back at the history of corporations and their involvement in these issues, that was a turning point, and it led to what we did in Georgia. It led to what some incredible companies like PayPal did in North Carolina, IBM in
PayPal
Texas.
Actually withdrew and pulled out.
They withdrew. They had
Right.
just made a commitment and said, we're not going in.
You know, the other thing, I don't know Salesforce's data. We talked a lot about data last night and how miserable the data is, that we get diversity data, and a lot of companies have stepped up to provide that, but there are misleading dimensions in that data, and that what is harder to get at, Tash was up here earlier and has some insights into this, and my colleague Liza Mundy has been working on this, is to look at the power relationships, to look at decision-making, look at inclusion in a more real way. And so I'm just interested in how you inside Salesforce look at this. How do you stack up on things like both diversity and inclusion in terms of being able to tell that story in an honest way?
Well, I think one of the most important things that we did is a little over a year ago, Mark actually created the role of Chief Equality Officer. And I think it's one of the only, or he likes to call it the other CEO role. And hired an incredible man, Tony Profit, who came down from Microsoft. He's had an incredible career in technology at HP, Microsoft, and joined us. He reports directly to Mark, and he's at our executive team meetings. And it was a way to make sure that we couldn't take our eye off this issue, that this can't be a fad. This can't be something we just talk about once a year. And he has formed an entire Office of Equality. We review numbers with him quarterly. We have daily discussions with him on keeping this going. And it forces us to look at the hard numbers, the diversity part, as well as to continue this inclusion conversation.
I assume you know Sheryl Sandberg.
I do.
I don't know if you guys hang out. There was also this kind of gasp about Sheryl Sandberg. You know, my ongoing lesson here in town is that the notion of lean in, it was felt by many I was talking to last night as sort of disingenuous. That first you've got the straight white male problem, then you have white women as being the next measure of this, and that the dimensions of power for women and people and LGBT, transgender, folks of color, the kind of broader array of folks aren't part of that Sheryl Sandberg equation. What do you think about that?
You know, I think we go through, first I thought Lean In was brilliant, and Lean In connected, interestingly, more, I felt, with men than with women. Sheryl spoke at Dreamforce a few years ago, and the impression from most of the women I was with was, it was a great speech, and yes, she was saying what we knew. I spoke to so many men who walked out of that really rattled, really kind of woken up by what they were hearing, and somehow she was making that connection in a way that I haven't seen anyone else break through. Now, I do think that we go through waves, and like I said, this book, Play Like a Man, was written with all of the best intentions by a woman who said there are unwritten workplace rules. Women need to know it, and I'm going to get to the bottom of it. Again, we wouldn't put that there. Lean In was another major step. And we'll keep refining the message as we go forward.
I want to go to the audience in a moment, but I want to just ask you about your friend Dara, whom you knew at
Yes.
Expedia and is all of a sudden the CEO of Uber, which reportedly had a pretty misogynistic, bigoted culture at its core. My apologies to anybody that is in Uber that is wants to take that on. But what do you think Dara is going to do, given your experience with him inside that? Because Uber's been such a placeholder and driver of this conversation.
Well, first, they could not have come up with a better choice. I mean, it was such a surprise to everyone. At least in Silicon Valley, this was the news. And I remember it was almost like watching for the new pope to be elected. We were waiting for that white plume of smoke, and no one had leaked Dara's name. I mean, it really came out of left field.
And people thought it was going to be Meg Whitman, Jeff Immel,
Yes.
or Ariana, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
And we saw it was Dara, and I just remember cheering at home because I knew that this was someone who, first, is up to the task, and second, is going to have the right values and just fundamentals to come into this. And I think he really showed this with London. So, within a week of, it's been kind of, what else could go wrong? But within a week of showing up, London pulled the license for them to operate. And I believe it's one of, their second or third largest market in the world. Dara went over there, and I'm going to be paraphrasing this, but essentially what he says is morals matter, values matter, and our choices matter. These things come back. And I was just really impressed that he wasn't making excuses. He was just reminding people this
I want to
matters.
talk to you about so much because
Yeah.
we had a friend from Lyft at the dinner last night. We had I interviewed the head of government affairs at Lyft recently. And it's interesting when you organize the culture of a company,
Yes.
how getting that early cultural DNA is so key.
Everything.
And it fundamentally does raise a question which itches at my brain on why doesn't economic gravity solve this problem? Why aren't the bad guys punished enough that they change? Why aren't the good folks rewarded economically? Maybe in Lyft and Uber that's happened, but do you think that happens, just real quickly, do you think that happens enough? Does economic gravity
I think it is.
put enough pressure?
I think we're at a turning point. I think it is.
Thank you. Let me go to the floor. Questions, comments.
Questions?
There's got to be someone here. I'm going to call on you. I'm going to go to you right in the front. You look so shy, but I know you've got a deep question right here. Yeah,
I do.
yeah. Well, either one of you, yeah. You can both ask it together. Helen, tell us who you are.
I'm Joandalyn Banstra from Prezi, and you talked a lot about books. What's your favorite book that you read recently?
Okay, that's a good one. Actually, in the last year, one of my favorite is by Ariana Huffington, and it's about
Sleeping?
Sleep.
Yeah.
And I'm trying to remember the full name of the book, The Sleep Revolution.
Right.
And it's incredible. It is truly about the miracle of getting enough sleep.
Who gets enough sleep?
I've read the
Okay,
book,
yeah.
so yes.
I'm so envious. I'm trying to get there.
No, but
Do you?
it's
Has
incredible.
it changed you?
I'm pretty religious and getting my sleep.
That's great.
I love
well,
it.
Well, thank you. Another question? Yeah, you want to go another one? We've now that see the front
Now-
row is
now
always
they're into
yeah. The
it.
front row can count on the front row
Hi.
right up here. Where's my
Hachi
mic?
from the 410.
Oh, oop.
My question
Back row.
goes back to what you were talking
Yeah.
about with the really bad advice in the book you'd read about how to adjust your behavior in order
Right.
to kind of push ahead or move forward. If you're going to switch that around and kind of talk to the male counterparts about
Right.
how to create a good space and how to be open and accepting of certain qualities or traits that are endemic, I guess, to women, like what's the advice you would say to men to allow women to be women and ourselves and still be
Right.
accepted and heard and listened to?
Great question.
That's great. That's not easy. I mean, I think the first thing is that you have to be true to yourself to begin with. And if you're not modeling the behaviors you expect from other people, it's never going to get there. But I think having these conversations, I think pointing this out is absolutely critical, even when it's awkward. I have also found one of the single best things that I have found from my male colleagues that they can do is simply making sure women's voices are being heard. My voice is higher, it's somewhat softer. It can be very frustrating for me at a meeting to get my voice heard. And I have a couple of wonderful colleagues who have really just made it their point to say, I'm sorry, Amy was talking, or I don't think she was finished. And in some ways, you know what? I don't like having to rely on anyone else for that, but it's been very, very powerful for me. And they also are now really looking out for that and looking out for that in other meetings and other skills. So I think it's a good way to get started on that
Do you
conversation.
train your managers in unconscious bias?
We do.
You do?
Yeah.
So you put me through that lesson sometime. I'll go sign up. Yes, one more right up here. God, now everybody in the front row wants to go.
That's great.
See what you started?
Hi, my name is Carlotta Brown, and I had a similar question, but on the other side.
Right.
And I do want to kind of take a pause to recognize you just coming here and speaking. I talked a bit about representation earlier. So as a woman who has a high voice as well and is feminine, but also I believe I have, the smarts and the ability.
Yeah.
And I know we can't always count on men to speak up for us and include us in the table, but I mean, look at what you've accomplished. Do you have any advice for, I'd say, women who have similar attributes, who want to move up and contribute in the workplace?
Terrific question. Thank you.
Again, it's to not change and not give in to that. I think it's the easiest thing you could do is just try to pretend to be someone else. But that takes a lot of energy. And you're going to do a much better job concentrating on yourself and moving forward. And one of the criticisms, or not coachings, that I find that we give way too often, especially to women, is what I mentioned before, which is don't be too nice. And this really came home for me. I worked a few years ago at a different company, worked with this wonderful young woman named Asha. She was great at her job. She had to make tough judgment calls. She was talented, she was smart. She was also very, very soft-spoken, and she was unfailingly polite. So after we left that company, she asked me to give a recommendation for a much larger job. So I get a call from the COO of the new company. I dash into my story, everything's wonderful. COO cuts me off and says, I only have one question. Is she too nice for this job? And it just, cut me to the quick, in that how have we started mistaking these terrific characteristics, which, by the way, being soft-spoken, I think is a great characteristic. Being nice, being polite, how has that come to be seen as a weakness? And I think we all have to recognize that these characteristics are a strength, and we need to celebrate those, and we need to insist on those in other people and praise them.
And on that note, what a powerful note to end on.
Right.
Amy Weaver, President and General Counsel of Salesforce. Thank you very, very much.
Thank you.